if you watch most television networks and read most newspapers, you'd assume that everyone is horrified by Suella Braverman's speech. However, I understand that polling that you've looked at tells a different story.
Yes, it does, Mark. I mean, I think the first thing to say is what Suella Braverman really said was not actually that controversial at all. Angela Merkel and David Cameron, we might remember, also said multiculturalism has failed. Theresa May called to leave the European Convention on Human Rights not that long ago. And so I think the reaction to the speech actually shows us, Mark, how far to the left, the cultural left, many of the people who dominate the institutions, you know, the media, the creative industries, the cultural institutions, have moved over the last decade. Now, look, on the polling, as I said on Twitter today, if you look at all of the recent polling on immigration, on Rwanda, on the ECHR, on people thinking that the borders are out of control, you know, typically between a half and 2/3 of all voters would basically agree with Suella Braverman. They would say that the borders are out of control, immigration has been too high, we need to do something in order to better control who's coming in and leaving the country. So I don't actually think what she said was so adrift from public opinion. I think actually that the new elite who dominate the institutions are adrift from much of the rest of the country.
Yes, and public anger, Matthew, about mass immigration is not limited to this country, is it? It seems to be a crisis of the West.
Well, absolutely. I think if you look at what's happening in Italy and much of Europe at the moment, we've clearly got a global migration crisis that is accelerating as each day passes the last. We've had 11,000 people arrive in Lampedusa in just a few days. There are about 300,000 people have arrived illegally in Europe over the last year, and there is no political consensus in Brussels, Strasbourg, Rome, Berlin about how EU member states actually want to deal with this issue. So I think what Suella Braverman is saying, and look, Mark, I know Suella Braverman reasonably well. You know, we've spent time together, we've talked about these issues, we've discussed the future of the country, and I think what she is really adamant about is getting ahead of this very mediocre, very unsatisfactory debate about immigration. Because, you know, if you're on the liberal left and you strongly disagree with Suella Braverman, that's fine, but you have to put forward your alternative. Now, what's your alternative to the illegal migration bill and the Rwanda scheme? What is your alternative to that? Because we have 40 million people in Africa and the Middle East who say they would like to move to Britain if they could do so tomorrow. So we need a viable immigration policy, and we need a grown-up, mature conversation about what our policy response is going to be. Because, Mark, simply saying let's have more safe and legal routes with no upper limit, that's not a response. And simply calling Suella Braverman a far-right agitator or a racist, you know, that is not a serious response. So my question to the liberal left would be, what is your policy response to this crisis? Because this is only the beginning, not the end, Mark. This is just the beginning of a global migration crisis which is going to change our world in ways we cannot really comprehend currently.
Well, yes, and fair play to Emmanuel Macron, who said in a television interview earlier this week that we cannot accept the misery of the world. And I think that was honest of him to say that. Briefly, Matthew, if you can, do you not think, though, that critics of Braverman have a point that the language is inflammatory, that it's dog whistle politics? She spoke a few months ago about an invasion. Does she cross the line?
I think there are a few things that she probably could have rode back on. I think some of the talk in her speech around particular minority groups experiencing harassment, discrimination, and so forth probably could have been left out. She could have kept this, Mark, just to be about a debate around changing the Refugee Convention. But Suella wants to start a debate in this country, and she wants to actually start a debate in the world about how we're going to update the architecture of refugee policy so it's more in line with the reality of the world today.
Do check out Matthew's excellent Substack articles, which can be found at matthewjgoodwin.org, or follow him, Goodwin MJ, on Twitter, the voice of common sense. Thank you, Matthew.